was, instead, a sort of sugary confection, made up of many thin and brittle layers, each nested delicately within each other and interpenetrated by voids, shafts and vaults, through which a ship could move nearly as freely as in open space. The outer surface, from which the launch was bouncing its range-finding pulses, was only loosely spherical. There were gaps in it, some of which were whole leagues across. Between these absences were irregular plates of uninterrupted surface, some of them joined by thick necks of connecting material, and some by only the narrowest, most perilous-looking of isthmuses. Nowhere was this surface layer more than 1/10 of a league thick, and in places it was considerably thinner. Little domed communities, never more than 1/4 of a league across, spangled against the firmer-looking bits of surface. Now and then, a tiny train moved between them, a luminous worm hurrying through a glassed-over tube. With their speed reduced to just 500 spans per second, Fuhrer dropped the launch down through one of the larger gaps. The thickness of the surface plate swept up past them, and then they were into what was technically the interior of Mulgrison. There was little sense of confinement. In many directions it was still possible to see stars, as well as a dozen or so nearer worlds and the purple ruby glimmer of the greater congregation. Beneath them, about a league below, was a smaller broken surface, ornamented with domes and the fine, glistening threads of railway lines. There were domes and lines above them as well, for there were communities attached to the underside of the outer shell, as well as to its outer surface. Only the thinnest of connecting structures bridged the two layers, and it seemed quite impossible that these feeble-looking columns and walls could support anything, let alone many square leagues of habitable ground. But they did, and they had, and they would. Mulgrison was already millions of years old, and it had been claimed and lost and reclaimed many times during the long cycles of civilization collapse and rebirth that made up the recorded history of the congregation. Fuhrer dropped their speed further still. Traffic was thick all the way into Mulgrison. Rocket launches were coming and going in all directions, with little regard for any sort of organised flow. Cargo scows and rocket tugs growled by on their slow, ponderous business. For every ship about the size of their own launch, though, there must have been 10 or 20 smaller craft that were only used for shuttling within and around the world, and these seemed even more cavalier about navigational etiquette. They were nosy about it too, swerving close to the launch and only breaking off at the last second. The anti-collision alarm was going off so frequently that in the end Fuhrer cuffed it into silence. They went down another level. Only now was it getting hard to see any clear part of space, and the communities at these depths had to rely on artificial lights at all times of day. There were more of them, packed more closely together, and in places the towns had merged so thoroughly that they were now merely the districts of city-sized settlements, easily the rival of anything on the Ness sisters' homeworld. The domed-over buildings were huge, multi-storied affairs, and their windows so numerous that they seemed to emanate a soothing golden glow of comfort and prosperity. Carved animals reared up from roof lines, picked out by spotlights. Neon advertisements flickered on the building sides. Traffic lights threw red and green hues across pavements and intersections. People were still too small to see, except as moving dots. Even the trams and buses were like tiny gaming pieces. But it was not hard to imagine being down there, dressed for the season, and strolling along lovely marbled boulevards lined with grand shop windows, and no shortage of enticing places to dine and dance. Fuhrer looked at her sister, wondering if Adrana felt any pangs of homesickness at this spectacle of bustling civilization. "I'd forgotten," Adrana began. "How pretty things could be," Fuhrer finished darkly, and her sister met her eyes and gave the merest nod of mutual understanding. "How nice decent society looks from the outside. How pleasant and inviting. How ready to accommodate our every wish. How devious and deceitful. It's a trap, sister, and we ain't falling for it." "I didn't say I was about to." Fuhrer slowed them again. They descended through the gap between two domes, then continued on down through the thickness of another layer, until they emerged beneath its underside. There was one more layer below, totally enveloped in a single glowing mass of buildings. That was the closest settlement to the Swallower, which was somewhere deep.